United States Marine Corps.
What was your highest rank?
My highest rank was sergeant.
Just tell me how you got involved in the Marine Corps. Were you drafted? Did you enlist?
I enlisted shortly after high school. I attended one semester at Sacred Heart where I did not distinguish myself. And I wanted to actually enlist right after high school, but I was 17 and my mother would not let my father sign me up. So I had to wait till I turned 18 and went and enlisted on my own.
Why did you want to enlist, and why did you choose the Marine Corps?
I've been asked that before, and I grew up in a family where my father, my uncles, all my friends' fathers had all served in World War II and some in Korea as well. And the Vietnam War seemed like it was our generation's war, and I felt an obligation to enlist. And I thought, if you're going to enlist in the best. So I went with the Marine Corps.
Do you recall the date?
I actually enlisted on December 18th, 1966, and went to boot camp on April 10th, 1967.
Now, you went to boot camp down at Parris Island.
I went to Parris Island, yes.
Can you tell me what that was like? How long? What were some things that you did down there? Some memorable experiences?
Well, Parris Island, we started off actually with, I think, 85 recruits, and we graduated, I think it was 8 or 10 weeks later with 55, so they dropped about 30. And this was during the Vietnam War when they were looking to get as many recruits out as they possibly could. But the training is pretty typical for that era. It's pretty tough. But I had gone through Catholic grammar school, Catholic high school, so going to boot camp at Parris Island really didn't faze me all that much.
Do you recall any of your instructors?
The only one I remember, Staff Sergeant Anderson, was the head drill instructor in our platoon. Our platoon was platoon 163. We were in the 1st Battalion at Parris Island. They had old wooden barracks from World War II. So yeah, that was where we trained out of.
What can you recall about Staff Sergeant Anderson?
He was tough, but he was a pretty fair guy. The other junior drill instructors, most of them were pretty good. There was one corporal that was a little tough, I think more so than he needed to be. But the Marine Corps had just gone through a period in 1956 where they had actually had a drill instructor drowned about 10 or 12 recruits in the tidal basin behind our barracks. So the atmosphere changed somewhat, and so they weren't nearly as physical as they probably had been a few years earlier.
After your graduation from boot camp, where did you go?
From there, we went to Camp Geiger up at Camp Lejeune for advanced infantry training, and that was another month or 6 weeks. And then from there, we went on our different assignments. I was slated to be in communications, so I went to MCRD San Diego for radio communications training.
Did you choose communication, or did the Marine Corps decide that's what you were going?
You don't choose anything in the Marine Corps; they choose it for you. So actually, I joined the Marine Corps so I could get out of school. Wound up testing very high, so they put me in communications. So I wound up actually going back to school in the Marine Corps for a while. But,
had you had any prior experience with communication?
Absolutely none. I had no communication experience at all. They felt that was the MOS that I would be best suited for. So I went through radio communications and electronics training out in San Diego. I have to say that San Diego is a very nice duty station to be at. It's convenient to the airport, Lindbergh Field, so I had the second cousin that lived up in San Francisco at the time with 4 other girls. So I used to fly up there at least once a month, and they'd take me all over San Francisco and all over the area. So it was actually a pretty good duty for about 10 months. Yeah.
So your training there was for 10 months?
About 10 months,
So
yeah.
tell me what that was like. What did they teach you? What kinds of skills did you learn?
Well, most of the training was basic electronics and communication. Those of us who finished higher in the class then went on to an advanced communication class where we were trained in crypto technology. And didn't do a lot of that over in Vietnam. In fact, when we all got shipped over to Vietnam, most of us got you know, assigned to pretty rudimentary radio communications. So I was assigned to an artillery battalion over there. So we did a lot of fire direction center work, and also sometimes, occasionally went out in the field and did FO work.
Was most of your training then classroom training in San Diego?
Classroom in the beginning, and then some practical application afterwards, how to actually use the communication equipment, how to fix it, how best to use it.
Did you live right there on base?
Lived right in barracks in San Diego, which was really nice. They had since, shortly after we graduated from that class, they moved all the communications up to 29 Palms in the middle of the desert. So I was very happy to have had the opportunity to spend the time at San Diego rather than have to go up to 29 Palms.
After your 10 months there, did you have leave before you went overseas?
Yeah, we did. We had a leave after graduation, and then we came back and had 2 weeks of jungle survival training up at Camp Pendleton.
And what was that like?
Well, they did very basic skills of survival. The Marine Corps Code of Conduct, Armed Forces Code of Conduct, what happens if you get captured, and general survival training.
Did you realize this whole time that you were going through all your training that you would be going to Vietnam?
I think we were all pretty much assured that almost every one of us was going to go to Vietnam. Yeah, this was right in 1968, early part of 1968. The Tet Offensive was taking place, so they were interested in getting as many people overseas as possible.
When did you get orders to go overseas?
I got orders in probably April upon graduation from radio school. But yeah, graduation from radio school, then we all got our assignments to Vietnam.
Did you go as an individual or did you go with a unit?
No, we went as individuals. They needed communications people, so there were probably, I'm going to guess, 40 or 50 of us in communications that flew over at the same time. And then once we were in Da Nang or in Okinawa, Camp Hansen for a while staging, and then we got shipped over to Vietnam to Da Nang. And then from Da Nang, we were quartered there for a couple of days until they found the units we were going to be assigned to. So once we got into Da Nang, all of us in communications got, sent out to different units for assignment.
Did you stay for long in Okinawa or was it just a stop over there?
Okinawa was only a 3 or 4 day stop, and it's probably one of the craziest places I've ever been to in my life, because everybody in Camp Hansen was either on their way to Vietnam or coming back. There were really no rules there. There was really not much control, and so people were pretty wild there. So it was a pretty crazy place.
What was your first impression when you landed at Da Nang?
Oh, well, the first impression of Da Nang was, first of all, we went over in a commercial airliner. And all I remember is coming over to Da Nang, and they're saying that they were going to take a steep descent into the airport, and they weren't kidding. I couldn't believe that a commercial jet could almost go vertical to come down to land, but they did it to avoid ground fire. So it was pretty. The flight in was quite an experience. Yeah.
Welcome to Vietnam.
Yeah, welcome to Vietnam. And then they opened the door and you came out, and then the heat and smell just hit you right in the face.
Now this was April of '68?
No, actually, this was May of 1968 that I got over there.
How long did you actually stay in Da Nang before you got
In Da Nang 2 or 3 days, and I couldn't wait to get out of Da Nang because we were billeted at the airport. And every night there, we got rocketed. So, they were targeting, obviously, the aircraft. Um, and I couldn't wait to get out of those barracks at the airport.
What were you thinking? Here you've been in this nice place, San Diego, going up to your cousins every month, and now you're in Da Nang, getting rocketed every night.
Yeah.
What was going through your head?
That I probably should have rethought my options a couple of years, a year or so ago.
So when you got stationed, where did they send you to? What unit?
They sent me to 4th Battalion, 11th Marines. It's an artillery unit, and I was, stationed basically at headquarters battalion. We had 3 batteries out in the field: Kilo, Lima, and Mike batteries on Hill 65, 55, Hill 10, I think was another one. So we would go out to the various batteries and work in coordination with the gunners out there.
So can you describe exactly what your role as communications would be with these batteries?
Well, there were shared duties, so I was technically a radio repair and operator. So I would go out to the batteries to make sure all their communications was working properly. And then while you're out there, you stood your share of guard duty. You went on patrols. You went on convoy duty, security. So you did your day job, and then you did the rest of your stuff too. So.
What radios were you trained to use, and what were you using in the field mostly?
In the field, we're using a PRC 25, which was the back radio. You can carry it on the back. It was also a stationary unit. They had some other larger units, but for the life of me, I cannot remember their names. And then they had crypto equipment, which was probably World War II vintage crypto equipment that we were trained on, that they had that really didn't work all that well. It's pretty dated stuff, so it's tough to keep it operational.
What can you tell me about the PRC 25?
Pretty solid radio. If you carried it, you usually carried it with 3 large batteries, one that was operational and 2 backups. If you were fortunate enough to have a lieutenant that was not trying to get you killed, he didn't put a whip antenna on it. They had 2 types of antennas: a long whip antenna, it's about 15, 20 feet high, and then a tape antenna, which was one you could pull down into your strap, so you could conceal it a little bit.
So as the radio man, were you responsible for repairing that and keeping those radios operating, or for carrying them and being the one to talk to them?
Well, you did both. You shared duties. So if you were finished repairing radios and some group was going on patrol, or they had an operation they needed somebody on, you went out and you did that. So.
For your whole time in Vietnam, were you located at this same general area?
Yes, in the same general area. I was within a 20-mile radius of Da Nang. Basically between Da Nang and Chu Lai, Liberty Bridge area.
So you were out in the boonies. Was it a base? Were there barracks?
There were we didn't have barracks. We had the best combinations we had were hooches, which were plywood side, tin roofed places back at headquarters. When we got in the field, most of the stuff was either crates of ammo boxes you filled with sand, and you made do inside a makeshift hooch.
So most of your time in Vietnam was spent in the field?
A good part, but probably 70% of it was spent out in the field.
Can you describe a typical day, if you could have such a thing?
Typical day.
Like when, I'm guessing you didn't have a 9 to 5.
No, it wasn't a 9 to 5. Well, typically, if you were working on your communication stuff during the day, there wasn't a lot for us to do during the day unless we had fire missions to make, or one of the Marine infantry units made contact, or we had a fire mission that had to be fired on. So during the day, you made sure all your equipment was was good to go because most of the activity occurred at night. So you got done with that. You grab some chow, maybe grab a little sleep, and then you had your guard post to take care of. Or if you had to go out on a patrol, you went on a patrol at night.
And then what would happen at night?
Well, if you're lucky, nothing. Nothing happened at all. You sometimes you get probed. Sometimes there'd be firefights. Sometimes, most of the time, a good part of the time, I have to say, really nothing went on. But when it went on, it was what they call the mad time.
Did you see combat?
Some. I can't say that I saw it every day by any means, but yeah, I saw some.
Can you recall any specific situations?
Oh, there's a lot of situations.
Tell me about a few of them.
I remember crossing a graveyard and taking fire from a tree line and ducking down behind these makeshift headstones and firing back from on top of the cemetery stone into the tree line. You couldn't see anything. You could see some muzzle flashes maybe, but not too much. But yeah, it was that, and you get rocketed and mortared. You have we had one instance where, or actually two of the hills I was on, I won't say were overrun, but we had people get inside the wire and blow up a motor pool with a couple of our guys were killed. Yeah, mostly mortared and rocketed.
Now, you were always traveling with an artillery unit. How big a group would this be?
Well, it depended. One of the bigger hills was Hill 55, and that was a pretty large hill up there, and so there were a lot of artillery units on that location. The base camp where we were at was Hill 34. There was an Army artillery battalion that was attached to us that had 175 guns, which were long-range guns, and they also had 8-inch, which were kind of big and circular around. The artillery unit I was with had 155 self-propels that civilians mistake for a tank, but it's a self-propelled artillery piece, and then what they call 155 toads. Those are ones that actually tow on the back of a truck. So different hills had different configurations. Some would have as many as a dozen of these guns. Some would have, a few. If you went on an operation, you were supporting. I went on 16 combat operations when I was in Vietnam, and sometimes they would hell lift the artillery pieces out to a hill, out to a fire base, and they would man the fire base for whatever period of time the operation was going on, and then take everything back out again.
16 combat operations, that's a lot. So think back to what those 16 operations were and describe something.
Well, some were short in duration. Some were only a matter of, operations only lasted a few days. Some lasted, upwards of a month. Most of the really heavy combat work was done by our infantry folks. They were, really squared away guys. They were and they saw the brunt of the action. For the most part, we were just firing support for them. They would call in artillery, or in some cases air support, and occasionally I would be out in the field as the radio operator for a forward observer. So a forward observer, usually an officer, and he would take charge of the situation, call in the artillery, I would do the call in, and so forth.
For the the operation lasted a month, did you stay in the field the entire month?
You would, if you were on a fire base, you probably were in and out. You know, you were out for a while.
Now, when units called in for artillery support, you were the radio operator, would you actually get the call from?
When we were in the, it's interesting. One of the stories how things happen is they have a fire direction center. So the person out in the field would call in, or an infantry unit would call in. Most often, you would have coordinates that were pre-registered. So if you knew a Marine unit was going on in a particular area, and you knew the area they were going to be in, you would pre-register your fire. You'd know where you're going to have to fire at if they made contact. And one night in the fire direction center, I was on the radio, and there were two Marine units, patrol units that had gone out, and they were supposed to be paralleling one another. At some point, one of them crossed into the path of the other one and thought it was the enemy, and they started a firefight with each other, which was going on for about 5 or 10 minutes, which is an absolute lifetime in a firefight. 5 or 10 minutes is a long time. Finally, one of the radio operators called in, who I knew both radio operators. One called in, calling in artillery on a position. And we're just about ready to fire, and the second radio operator called in to call in artillery on what he thought was the enemy. And we're looking, there was two of us there, we're looking at it and said, whoa, wait a minute, they're both firing at one another. So we told them to check fire, you're firing at friendlies. And so they ceased fire. And what's amazing, a couple of things are amazing. One is that we were able to stop it. The second one is nobody got hit. So nobody got hit in this 5 or 10 minute firefight. So that was one of those, moments.
You know how a lot of times you'll hear the stories how infantry had to fall in artillery pretty close to themselves or right on themselves. Were you ever a part of that?
We called in, it was really a predetermination by by whoever the field commander was as to how close the artillery was to come in. Obviously, you don't want to hit friendlies, so but if they were really, really close, they would call it in pretty tight to their unit. And the Viet Cong knew that, and the North Vietnamese knew that too. So they figured as close as they could get to one of the Marine units or the Army units, then artillery was rendered pretty much useless. They couldn't do that. But yeah, they would call them pretty close.
Were there any casualties in your unit?
We had six guys in our unit who were killed.
Were those on any missions that you were on?
Yeah, one in particular, I remember we actually came back off of patrol, and we were done with the patrol, and we had left our gear by a kind of a dirty pond at the bottom of the hill, and had one of the new guys watch our radio, watch my radio, watch our rifles and our gear and so forth while we went in and cleaned up this pond. And I'll never forget it. There was a village there, and I watched as this 8 or 9 year old kid came running up to the Marine that was sitting there. I don't even remember his name. And he was running, and it just caught me. It caught my eye, and he threw a grenade and then ran off and killed the guy. And we were all, the rest of us were all in the water, pretty helpless. So we jumped up right away, and the guys came down off the hill, and I don't think they ever got the kid. That was not uncommon.
Ray, were you awarded any medals or citations?
Just the pretty standard ones, the Vietnam Campaign, Vietnam Service Medal, I think there was a Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry, Combat Action Ribbon.
Did you sustain any injuries?
No, I did not.
I'm gonna switch gears for a couple minutes and ask you some questions about daily life. How did you stay in touch with your family when you were over there?
Well, it was all by letters. There were no no emails, no cell phones, so it was all letters, and that was probably one of the most important parts of the day. Was mail call, yeah, mail. That was pretty cool. If you had a girlfriend and she was nice enough to put perfume on the envelope, that made a big difference too.
Were you a good letter writer?
I wasn't too bad. If I knew I was going to be out in the field, I would write letters in advance to my parents and date them out, and then have somebody put them in the mailbox, every other day or so. So
Mail service for delivery was pretty good. You got regular mail delivery?
yeah, it was pretty good. Yeah.
What was the food like?
Well, if you were at our headquarters battalion, it wasn't bad. You would get hot meals out in the field.
3 meals a day?
Oh yeah, you'd get three meals a day when you're back at base camp. In the fields, it could go anywhere from one hot meal a day, and the rest C rations, or you're on C rations all the time.
What did you have in your C rations?
Oh, you had bacon and eggs, or ham and eggs. You had cans of fruit. You had packets of cigarettes. You had packets of chocolate. I'm trying to think of some of the other meals. Just spaghetti and meatballs. Everybody would fight for the fruit. Everybody wanted the fruit. The peaches, and peaches were a big one. Nobody wanted the ham and lima beans. They had a very vulgar term for ham and lima beans. I'm trying to other fruit they had there. Peaches sticks out in my mind though. Peaches, pears.
Did you always have enough supplies, ammunition, parts for your radios, clothing, or were there shortages of anything?
No, actually, no, not really. We were pretty well supplied. The only time I can remember, it was funny. When I was about 12 years old, I was in the Boy Scouts, and we went on a camporee, and then our scoutmaster took us on a very, very long hike, and we had our canteens, and we all drank our water, and we were all thirsty because we still had a long way to go. And he sat us down for a lesson. He said, "Look, there's 2 lessons to be learned here. One is always conserve and prepare and know what you're going to do. And the second is for every problem there's a solution." So he said, "I want everybody to pick up a very small stone, clean it up as best you can, and put it underneath your tongue. And that'll keep you salivating so you won't be thirsty." And so we did that, and it worked out well. Well, 7 years later, on an outpost in Vietnam, and we didn't get resupply. We didn't have water. So I said to the guys, "Hey, look, pick up a little stone, wash it off, put it underneath your tongue, and it'll help you salivate." And of course, I got ridiculed a bit for that. But the ones that tried it say, "Hey, yeah, it really works. It works out very well." So I was called the Soda Boy Scout. They had an expletive for Boy Scout for them. But it worked. It was kind of funny that 7 years later the Boy Scout experience helped out.
How did you handle the stress of the job when you were overseas?
Everybody was kind of in the same boat, and you were watching out for, the other guy you were with. There's a reason they send 19-year-olds over to Vietnam, because they tend not to have the same fear factor. You certainly were afraid. You can't say you were not afraid. Anybody who says they weren't afraid is an idiot. Yeah, you handle it.
Did you do anything special for good luck?
No, I can't say that I did anything special for good luck. No.
How did people entertain themselves when you were not on duty?
Music was a big thing. Everybody had tape recorders. We used to. I think cassette tapes were probably in vogue then. So mostly cassettes. Um, Occasionally there'd be a USO show that would come in, so you got to go to a USO show.
Did you see any USO shows?
I saw a Bob Hope show around Christmas in 1968 in what they call Freedom Hill 327. He came in, and we were probably about 1,000 yards away from the stage, but Joey Heatherton was there and Ann Margaret, so that was kind of cool.
Did you get any leave or you left?
I actually got to go on R&R to Australia, so I went to Sydney, Australia for R&R.
What was that like and how long?
That was 7 days, and it was fantastic. The Australian people were probably the nicest people in the world, and they treated us so well. You couldn't go into a bar where they'd let you buy a drink. The women were very friendly, and the weather was beautiful. Yeah.
Did you go with a bunch of the guys that you knew, or did you just go by yourself?
There was one or two other guys I went with, but there was a plane load of us that went there. In fact, I think we were among the first to go to Australia and R&R. This is January 1969. And I remember that because they had just finished the Opera House in Sydney Harbor. It had just been completed.
Did you go?
No, I didn't go anywhere near Opera House. That was not on my list of things to do.
What's your opinion of the officers that you served under?
For the most part, the officers we had were pretty squared away. They were pretty good. I have no issues with any of our officers.
What about your opinion of your fellow Marines?
Well, I wouldn't. There's no, greater bunch of guys I'd rather serve with.
Did you stay in touch with any of your friends from over there?
Yeah, there's about a half a dozen of us that stay in touch. In fact, we went down to the dedication of the Vietnam statue in 1984, and there was, I think, 5 of us that met from all over the country: Oklahoma, Arkansas, New York State, Upper New York State, Wyoming. So.
And are you still in touch today?
Yes. Yeah. We're on with email, makes it really easy. So there's still about the 6 of us that stay in touch, and one of them I'm going to go see in less than a week out in Cody, Wyoming.
How long did you stay in Vietnam? When did you leave there?
Marines tour duty in Vietnam was 13 months. So I was there for the full 13 months.
Do you recall the date that you left?
I'd say it was on June 18th of 1969.
Do you remember what it was like being a short timer leading up to the June date of departure? One of those short timer calendars?
Everybody had a short timer calendar. Even if you're there in country 2 days, you had a short timer calendar. And so, yeah, everybody kept track of it. In the beginning, it really didn't matter much at all. You didn't pay any attention really to the calendar until you started getting, over the hump, and you saw the end was coming. So.
What did it feel like? Do you remember your last day in country?
I remember there was a certain amount of sadness leaving the guys that were there because, we didn't go over as a unit, and we didn't go back as a whole unit. We went back, a couple of guys at a time. So, yeah, it was kind of sad in a way because you'd spent 13 months pretty close with these guys, and then you were going to leave them, and by and large, you knew you weren't going to see them again. So.
Did you fly back through Okinawa again?
Fly back, right through Camp Hansen again, yeah. Survived Camp Hansen.
And where did you land in the U.S.?
Landed at El Toro Air Station in California.
Did you stay there for any length of time, or were you immediately discharged?
No, I wasn't discharged. I still had plenty of time left in the service, so I I landed El Toro, and I took a flight out of, I think, L.A. to come back home.
So that was in Connecticut. How long were you leaving before you were assigned your next duty?
I was either 20 or 30 days leave. I remember coming back, and it was it was in the middle of the night. It was like I got into Bridgeport around 12, 1 o'clock. Took a cab up to about a mile or two from my house, and then had the cab driver drop me off, and I just walked along my hometown home just to kind of get the feel of things.
What was that like for you coming back after having been overseas?
I needed that time just to get, you know, it's funny, when growing up, my father was a very devout Catholic. I used to go to a church, St. Teresa's Church, about 2 miles from our house. And I remember walking with him on, blizzards. He'd always go on a Sunday. If it was a blizzard, he didn't care, he was going to go. And I used to walk along with him. So it was about a 2-mile walk, and it was kind of quality time. So I had the cabbie drop me off at the church, and then I walked from there to my house and surprised my parents at like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning.
They didn't know you were coming?
They didn't know I was coming home.
Wow. What was it like in your hometown for that 20 or 30 days that you were home?
Yeah, a couple of things I remember very vividly about that time. One is the night before I left to go to Vietnam. One of my best friends who I grew up with 2 doors away from me. We went to grammar school and high school together, and we double dated and all that. He had gone over to Vietnam a couple of months before me, and he was killed the night before I left to go over. His family found out that he had been killed the night before I left to go over. So it all of a sudden became not so much an adventure as this was real stuff. And so coming back home, I knew I would have to see his family. And that was difficult. They couldn't have been nicer or more glad to see me. It was still, that was very tough.
What was his name?
Robert Leska.
So that was one of the things that you did in that time that you were home?
Yeah. One of the things that really helped during that period of time was another close high school friend of mine came back from Vietnam. We didn't know it. We didn't know we were coming back at the same time. We came back within probably 15, 20 minutes of each other. And so we kind of hung together the whole time we were on leave. It was too much of a jump in that short period of time to come from Vietnam back home. You had nobody to talk to, so we kind of stayed very close that time. I'll never forget another high school friend of ours, Ron Barnaby. His father owned a big construction company and owned a huge cabin cruiser, and found out that we were back, and he had us come down. And I'll never forget, he took us on the boat. He had cases of beer, took us over to Port Jeff, had a big lobster dinner. I mean, he just went out of his way for us. I'll never forget that.
And that was Barnaby?
Mm-hmm.
Once your leave was over, where were you assigned?
I got stationed at Camp Lejeune, a place called Courthouse Bay. I was assigned to 2nd Amtrak Battalion.
What were your duties?
I was in charge of communications for the Amtrak Battalion. And I was one of the few guys in the outfit. There was a few of us, but there was more newer recruits there than veterans there. And the top sergeant there said, we were 25 miles from the main side of the base, so we were out in the middle of nowhere. He said, you don't want to really stay here. He said, I'll give you a choice. I'll send you to Marine Corps Barracks Honolulu, Marine Corps Barracks, Washington, D.C., or you can go on a Mediterranean cruise with the 6th Fleet. So I immediately took the 6th Fleet cruise. The prospect of going out to Hawaii meant I would be too close to going back to Vietnam. Washington, D.C. in 1969 was not a place for anybody in the military to be. In fact, we were put on call at one point in time for the protest up in Washington. And the prospect of having to go up there and do anything with, probably some of our friends were in the crowd was not something any of us wanted to do. So going on the med cruise was a great way to decompress.
Well, how long was the cruise?
6 months.
So what was that like? Where did you go? What did you do?
That was probably the most fun I've had. 6 months of fun I had in my entire life. The only problem was getting over there. We were on the USS Waukegan County was an LST, and it took us 17 days across the Atlantic.
You crossed the Atlantic in an LST?
An LST, yeah. And I don't think it was meant to do that, but we did. We crossed it. And 4 days was so rough they couldn't open the mess hall, so we had to eat sea rations. We were back on sea rations again. But once we got in the med, it was great. We had we went to Spain, France, Italy, Greece, Malta. We had landing operations in Sardinia and Corsica. In Corsica, we had joint operations with the French Foreign Legion. But yeah, no, traveling around Europe was it was great.
Well, when you were actually at sea and traveling, what did you do during the day?
Mostly read and listened to music. If the weather was good, you were up on top of the deck doing PT or whatever the duty you had, making sure your radio equipment was good. If you had too much steam to burn off, we would box down in the tank deck. Sailors and Marines always found a reason to fight, so we go down in the tank deck and box.
After your 6-month cruise, where did you go?
Came back to Camp Lejeune, and I don't think I was there very long. I had just enough time to maybe go for a short tour back to Vietnam, but the Marines were starting to get pulled out at that time. So I wound up going to the career planning officer and finding out what opportunities there were. And he said, if you join a police department, they'll pay for college for you. For every 2 years you spend in a police department, to pay for a year of college. There was this was separate and apart from the GI Bill. It's called the Omnibus Safe Streets Act, 1968. And so I enrolled at the University of New Haven when I got back, and in criminal justice program, and was accepted on the New Haven and Trumbull Police Department the same day. So I took the Trumbull Police Department and did my undergraduate degree while I was on the department, and then went to law school and got my law degree.
Did you feel differently about school after having served?
Oh yeah, I mean the difference in that 4 years was tremendous. I mean, if I had stayed in college right out of high school, I would have probably barely maintained a C average, and I certainly wouldn't have gotten into law school. But when I came back, I was truly I was motivated and certainly more mature. So I was on the dean's list through college, and then went to law school.
Did you need to use the GI Bill, or did the Safe Street Act was sufficient?
Well, I was able to do both. So the Safe Streets Act, like I said, for every 2 years you're on a police department, it forgave 1 year of college. So the money I got from the GI Bill actually helped pay the mortgage on the house.
When were you discharged from the Marines? What do you call the date?
Sometime in August 1970.
Do you recall your last day in service?
Yeah, I do actually. I thought it was really pretty neat. There was a couple of us that were getting out, and they had a platoon formation. All the units we served with.
This is down at Camp Lejeune?
This is at Camp Lejeune, Courthouse Bay, and the commanding officer of our group came out and gave a nice speech about us, and wished us well in civilian life, and it was pretty. It did a really nice job of seeing us off.
When you went back to Camp Lejeune after having been in Vietnam, were you in contact with the new young guys who hadn't been over yet?
Some. I do remember at that time probably the biggest issue that was going on was a lot of racial. There was a lot of racial tension in the service. I mean, all the branches of the service, but we certainly had our fair share down there, and it was a very difficult time because in Vietnam we served with a lot of African American guys, and they were great, and I still stay in touch with one of them. Yeah, it was difficult coming back. Things changed. The country was changing. There was a lot happening in 1969. It wasn't pretty, and so it was a good time to get out because it was getting very, very ugly.
When you came back, what was the biggest change in the country that you can recall?
Biggest change in the country. You know what? I was. You didn't. I didn't feel like I said, that leave from Vietnam. The guy's name was Russ Benjamin, and if it hadn't been for him, I don't know. I probably would have made it through. I'm not going to be over dramatic about it, but it would have been extraordinarily difficult to be at home. You couldn't talk to anybody about the experiences. And I really couldn't wait to get back to a duty station, to be around the same guys again. So it was very uncomfortable, and you felt very much out of place.
What was your transition to civilian like after you were discharged from the Marine Corps?
Like I said, I enrolled in college. Actually, there was a few of us that were Vietnam veterans. Nobody. We were trying to grow our hair as quickly as we could, so that nobody would, associate us as Vietnam veterans, and nobody, aside from those of us who were, we didn't talk about it with anybody else. We didn't want anybody to know in college.
So, did you stay on as a Trumbull police officer while you were getting your law degree?
Yes. I was on the Trumbull Police Department for 14 years.
Once you had your law degree, did you practice law in Trumbull?
I did. I joined a law firm, and I practiced, and about the same time became involved in politics. Practiced for about a little shy of 20 years, and then was elected first selectman or mayor of my town of Trumbull.
How long did you serve as the first selectman?
8 years.
What made you want to go into politics?
Oh, I enjoyed it. I liked I liked the action. I liked what the people in the Democratic Party in Trumbull were doing for the community. I thought they were doing a lot of positive stuff, and I just wanted to make sure the town grew in the right way.
How would you say your military experience influenced your thinking about war or about the military in general?
The guys I served with were really good guys, really solid guys. Still do anything for any of them. And I'm very proud to have served in the Marine Corps. There was a transition period probably for 3 to 5 years after Vietnam that, we didn't talk about it. Really was kind of a difficult transition time. Wasn't quite sure why. I knew there was something going on, but I didn't know what. But I just was not, I don't know, just something was off. Coming to terms with it didn't come until much, much later. Probably in the last 15, 20 years, I've been able to come out and speak about it, and be comfortable with it.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
Yeah, I came back and I joined the VFW and American Legion. It was populated primarily by World War II and Korean veterans, and frankly, at that time, they weren't all that comfortable with Vietnam veterans, and their meetings they mostly drank a lot and argued with one another. So it wasn't. They were good guys, and they certainly served, but there wasn't, beyond just talking about their military experience. There wasn't something else they were doing. Again, I'm still a member of the American Legion and VFW. They still do, some really great work. Um, but it just wasn't that kind of an organization for me. On the other side was the Vietnam. Some of the Vietnam veterans groups at the time were pretty extreme, and I didn't relate to them either. So I was kind of somewhere in the middle. Um, as were a good number of guys. In fact, when we dedicated the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Trumbull, we kind of made a big deal about it and invited people to come to the dedication. And I'm seeing it, and I said, at the end, I said, with all the Vietnam veterans in attendance, please go over, stand by the flagpole. And there's probably 30 or 40 guys who came out of the crowd, guys I'd known in town for 25 years, 30 years, never knew that they were in the military, let alone in Vietnam. And, at that time, everybody started sharing experiences. So it was a catharsis for everybody.
Now, I know you were heavily involved in the creation of that Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Trumbull, Connecticut. Can you tell me about that and how that came about?
Sure. There actually was a beautification committee, and the woman's last name was Pavia. I can't think of her first name right now, but she approached Dr. John Willis, who was an Army surgeon in Vietnam, who was wounded, and I, about doing some fundraising to put together a Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And so we got some grants and we raised some money, and we had this park built, and we had a bridge going over the river, over the Paquonic River, built in honor of the 6 Vietnam veterans from Trumbull who had been killed. And we had a small sign that was up there, which was a replica of a Vietnam campaign ribbon. And a friend of mine, Dick Condon, he served in the Army at peacetime, but he drove by it one day and said, that's not a fitting enough memorial for this park. And with his own money, paid for a beautiful granite monument that's still in place, is in place now, which really is gorgeous. It's very, very nicely done.
Wow. Did you attend any reunions?
We really haven't had any reunions. No, I have not. I've visited with a few of the guys and seen them, but we have not had a formal reunion. Closest thing we had to that was the dedication of the Vietnam monument, the statue down in Washington, D.C. When they first built the Vietnam Memorial, none of us were really particularly crazy about it or the design. We were thinking something more traditional. So none of us went down to the dedication of the monument itself. We went down to see the statue of the 3 servicemen that's adjacent to the monument. But once we got down there and saw it, it just blew us away. And we were there for 3 or 4 days, and we'd be back at our hotel room, and guys said, I'm going to go outside for a smoke or something. They would disappear and go down to the memorial and just sit there. And all of us were doing it, but nobody was telling anybody else that they were doing it. And it's pretty compelling.
How did your military service affect your life?
I think for the most part, very, very positively. As I said, it certainly motivated me uh, educationally in terms of being more mature and getting my degrees. I don't think I would have accomplished any of that uh, had I not been in the service. Um, it taught me how to think and act well under very difficult situations, not to panic. That there's, and I met some tremendous friends that last a lifetime. In fact, one of the stories I think I told you about the Marine that was killed when the young boy threw the grenade. Um, like I said, there was a whole bunch of us in communications that had gone over at the same time but got separated, but we stayed in pretty much in touch with one another. And so, the old game telephone, somebody says something, it gets passed around, and the word got back to everybody that the not that the radio got blown up, but the radio operator was killed in that incident. So I rotated back to the States, and this one friend of mine, Tom Brennan, who I'd gone through boot camp with, Paris Island from New Jersey, and went to radio school with in San Diego. He thought I'd been killed. Again, years later, about every year around the Marine Corps birthday, you have too many beers and you get on the phone and try to reach out to people. And after 15 years of going through the phone book of Montclair, New Jersey for Brennan's, I finally got his mother and told her who I was and said he lives in Sparta, New Jersey. So I called his house and got his wife, and I said who I was. And he gets on the phone, he started screaming, I don't know, this is, I don't care who you are, this is not a funny joke. Ray Baldwin was killed 15 years ago, and he's a friend of mine. So for 15 years, he thought I was dead. And then I convinced him I wasn't, and we got together, and my wife and I went down to visit him and his family. And he was a burly guy, still a tough guy. And he put a bear hug on me. I thought he was going to crack my ribs. He was so happy to see me. He thought I was dead for 15 years. So that's one of those stories that come with it.
Ray, is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't talked about? Any other memorable experiences or incidents that you can recall?
Probably none repeatable on a tape, but no, I think the Vietnam veteran served his country extraordinarily well and with dignity. And the representation that was made of them post-war, I think, was a very unfair characterization. They have been very, very successful, generally speaking, in business and just about every professional walk of life they could be in. The statistics bear this out, that they earn more, they're good employees, they're good leaders, and I think that experience had a lot to do with it. They didn't lose the war, the government did.
Well, Ray, thank you for your service to our country, and thank you for this interview.
My pleasure.